Hi everyone. We will wait 2 more minutes to give time to people to join. Start in a couple of minutes. Thank you. Okay, I think we can start. We have one colleague who will join in a couple of minutes, who's a bit late because it's snowing again here in Geneva and transport is having issues this morning. Hello and welcome to all of you. Thank you for making the time to join us today. My name is Marianne Bertrand and I work for the International Service for Human Rights. It's a real pleasure to welcome a diverse group of activists, advocates, and movement leaders working at national and regional levels. Your work is grounded in local realities, struggles, and communities, and it is essential to shaping what international systems like the UN ultimately mean in practice. Today's webinar is designed to demystify what is often perceived as a distant or highly technical process, the UN80 reform agenda. I thank all the co-organizers, Civicus, the Coalition for the UN We Need, Forum Asia, Franciscans International, the Global Initiative for Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, GLEDES, and Racismo MX for making this webinar possible. You may have heard the term UN80 in different contexts. It is sometimes framed as a major institutional overhaul, sometimes as a response to political pressures, and at other times as an opportunity for renewal. But what does it actually mean? What is changing, what is not, and what should it matter to movements working far from Geneva or New York? This webinar starts from a simple premise. Reforms at the UN are needed in order to make this global multilateral human rights system more relevant and credible to current context and needs. And this requires that the UN80 is not just an internal bureaucratic process. Reforms shape the spaces, tools, and access points that civil society relies on to advance human rights. Whether it is how mandates are defined, how mechanisms engage with stakeholders, or how accessible these processes are to actors outside global hubs, these decisions have real implications for your work. During this webinar, we aim to do 4 things. First, to provide a clear and accessible update on the UN80 reform process, where it comes from, what has been decided so far, and what remains under discussion. Second, to clarify what UN80 is about and also what it is not, because there are many assumptions and concerns circulating, and part of our goal is to separate speculation from substance. Third, to explore what this reform could mean for engagement with UN human rights mechanism. Are there risks of shrinking space? Are there opportunities to reshape how engagement happens? And how might this affect the visibility of national and regional voices? And finally, we will use this webinar as a stepping stone to collectively identify entry points for NGOs and movements based outside Geneva and New York. Too often, participation is constrained by geography, resources, and access. And this conversation will look at how to navigate and potentially influence the evolving system from where you are. This is not intended to be a one-way briefing. We see this as a shared space for reflection and exchange. And we will have like 2 moments to ask questions, but please feel free to use the Q&A box to share your perspectives, questions, and experiences at any point during the presentations. At a moment when multilateralism is under pressure and when human rights movements are facing both new constraints and new opportunities, understanding these reforms is strategic. So thank you for being here, and I look forward to the discussion. Now I would like to introduce our presenters today. So first, Jebilson Raja Jocelyn from the Coalition for the UN We Need will explain what the UN initiative is. Then with Rafael Viana from ISHR, we will present what has been decided until now, the concrete impacts of these decisions and what we can expect in the coming month. And finally, we will share some considerations from our partner Heledes on transparency and participation in the process. We will have 2 moments, as I said, for you to ask questions that will be facilitated by Mathilde Baudaert from the Coalition for the UN We Need. So Jebilson, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marianne, and thank you for inviting me to the webinar. Hi, everyone. My name is Jebilson. I work as a research and coordination consultant with Coalition for the UN We Need. I'll briefly give an overview on UN80 and what are the implications for human rights. So as Marianne said, for those of us working in New York and Geneva, the UN80 is an ever-present topic. But for those of you working at the field level, it may sometimes be seen as a bureaucratic exercise and also disconnected from ground realities. But for better or worse, it is having an impact on human rights. So it is critical and strategic for civil society to stay informed and engaged. Many of you may already know this, but I think it will be useful to take a step back and remind ourselves of the origins of UN80. The UN Secretary General launched the UN80 Initiative in March of 2025 with the stated goal of updating the structures, priorities, and operations of the UN for the 21st century. The other goal was to ensure that the UN system remains effective, cost-efficient, and responsive to the people it serves. At that time, in March of 2025, UN80 was largely seen as a reaction to the increasingly difficult liquidity problems faced by the UN, and also as an attempt to get ahead of the dodging by Elon Musk and Washington. So there was a fear at some point that the UN will be next after USAID. The SG worked really hard to temper some of the extreme positions that were coming out of Washington. Whether or not he was successful in staving off the worst is up to each of us to decide. But it largely stands today that the impetus behind much of UN80 came from Washington. That said, I'll briefly go each work stream by work stream. The UN80 is organized into 3 different work streams, and each are in varying levels of advancement. First, work stream 1. This is the one that deals with identifying efficiencies and reducing the regular budget of the UN. This led to more than 2,500 job cuts across the UN system. As some of you may know, the differences among member states on the 2026 regular budget dragged the budget negotiations until the last day of the year, which is 30th December. Although the budget was adopted by consensus, only around 1/3 of the $3.45 billion budget has been paid for as of 20 March last week. I understand that ISHR colleagues will go into the details of what these budget cuts mean for human rights, so I'll not touch it here. But suffice it to say that the adopted 2026 budget for human rights is lesser than the 2025 budget. So this reminds me of a commitment that was made by member states in the Pact for the Future. The Pact for the Future is the outcome document of the 2024 UN Summit of the Future. In the Pact, member states requested the SG to assess the need for adequate, predictable, increased, and sustainable financing for UN human rights mechanisms. Adoption of this commitment in the Pact was a hard-won victory for CSOs. Now, the implementation of this commitment, meaning increased resources for the human rights mechanism, has been pushed to the 2027 budget. So it is important for civil society to continue our advocacy and hold member states and also the Secretariat to account for the commitment that they've already made in 2024. In concrete terms, I did not tell you that the budget cuts and the liquidity crisis is having real impact on the work of human rights. The most visible one are the limitations for travel, lack of funding for interpretation, meetings, reports for the various human rights mechanisms. So that is on work stream 1. This is the one that is most talked about, which is budget cuts, identifying efficiencies. Now I'll move on to work stream 2. Work stream 2 is the one that examines the creation, implementation, and review of all UN mandates, including those that are created by the Human Rights Council. So work stream 2 is also relevant for many of our work. To take work stream 2 forward, the General Assembly established an informal ad hoc working group in September 2025, and the permanent representatives of Jamaica and New Zealand were appointed as co-facilitators. Work stream 2 is largely with member states, with the Secretariat and the Office for the High Commissioner playing a supporting role. The High Commissioner is engaged in work stream through his statements, reports that are provided from the SG and other means. Some of the early ideas that were considered by the High Commissioner's office include the use of sunset clauses, reducing overlapping mandates, and making treaty body processes more efficient through simplified reporting and regional level engagement, among other ideas. So these were some of the early ideas that were presented by the Office of High Commissioner mid last year. Regarding the work stream 2 negotiations, the co-facilitators have been very clear from the very start that they did not intend to do a systematic review of individual mandates. This was attempted in the early 2000s when a similar exercise was carried out. But the co-facilitators are very clear that their goal is to not look back, but forward, to identify principles and actions to improve the creations, delivery, and review of mandates in the future. This was a politically wise decision in our view, but this approach is reaching its limits. Some member states have already asked for a systematic review of mandates, which we think will negatively affect the human rights work. So hence it is important for CSOs to stay vigilant and engage in work stream 2. C4UN has been working with the co-facilitators to create opportunities for civil society engagement in the proceedings of work stream 2. We have so far organized 2 consultations, one in December of 2025 and another in February last month. Without going into the details of the negotiations in work stream 2, I'll just say that the output, the latest output that we had was a near final resolution, which came out on 23rd March, this Monday. And there's some interesting language in that which proposes, quote, that the mandates in the charter and the norm setting mandates of universal character shall not be subject to such systematic reviews. We assume that this language will at least hold the line on human rights principles, but it's not clear to us who decides which mandates would qualify for such protection. So it is important for us to continue to keep watch and stay engaged in work stream 2. Now moving on to work stream 3. This is the work stream that deals with a review of the potential structural changes and program realignment in the UN system. The proposals that are considered include the merger of UNDP, UNOPS, UN Women and UNFPA, the sunsetting of UN8, and a whole host of smaller team and desk type mergers, particularly on gender and peace support. Whether or not these structural changes have the intended effect of reducing silos or increasing the impact on the ground is yet to be seen. But much will depend on how these structural changes are executed and how much the resulting entity will be supported politically and financially. That said, now specifically on human rights, as many of you may know, the work package number 9 of work stream 3 is the one that deals with human rights. It proposes to create a unified approach to human rights across the system by establishing a human rights group led by the High Commissioner. This is also a direct follow-up to Action Commitment 46B of the Pact for the Future. Both the UN80 and the Pact dashboards mention the status as in progress for this work package. What we gather from publicly available information is that preparations are underway for a principal level meeting. There are consultations going on relevant internal documents. ISHR colleagues have more to say on this, but from our view, it is not clear where these consultations are happening, how this group will function. And we think the lack of transparency in this whole process is creating more questions than answers about this group. Now, let me take the opportunity to slightly move away from Work Package 9. Work Stream 3 is not just Work Package 9, it also proposes some significant structural changes, like the proposal to merge UN Women and UNFPA. What this means for the rights of women across the world is a question that has been raised by many observers. From what we gather, it is no longer a question of whether the merger is happening. It is more about how the merger should happen. Um, some of these discussions are happening in the executive boards of these agencies where civil society does not have direct access. So it is important for civil society to engage with the member state delegations for concrete safeguards to protect human rights both during and after the merger. Another example is the sunsetting of UN8s. There are concerns among many stakeholder groups about the rights of people living with HIV, the shorter time frame for time setting, which is 2026. The proposal is to sunset it by 2026. The shorter time frame and how and whether a smooth transition can be facilitated when we sunset UN8. So as we see in these examples, the implications for human rights is not just limited to Work Package 9. So I invite all of you to broaden your focus beyond Work Package 9 to the entirety of Work Stream 3. Now that I've covered all the three work streams, let me make a broader political point. Some of these structural changes may be merited and in some cases long overdue, but in our view, the UN80 is trying to provide technical and managerial fixes to fundamentally political problems. No amount of efficiency or structural reform is going to replace the political will or the political consensus to match the mandates, budgets, and the actual collection of funds, which has caused a lot of the liquidity issues. So, and this is fundamentally a political problem. That said, let me end my presentation with a few takeaways for each of the work stream. For work stream 1, along with demanding member states to pay their assessed contributions in full and on time, CSOs should keep the pressure on the Secretariat and member states to uphold their commitment for increased funding for human rights in the 2027 regular budget. And on work stream 2, to advocate that the existing mandates already created by the Human Rights Council is not re-examined as part of work stream 2, including under the guise of reducing duplication of streamlining overlapping mandates. We think that this is a Pandora's box and ultimately will negatively affect human rights. Moving on to work stream 3, along with demanding transparency in the creation of the human rights group led by the High Commissioner, we must ensure that the proposed mergers and structural changes that are proposed do not negatively affect the normative development, the multilateral support that is provided towards implementation, and the upholding of human rights. So with this, I end my presentation. Thank you for listening. Back to you, Marianne.
Thank you, Jebilson. Rafael now is going to talk a little bit more about what has been already, what is already happening, what has been decided. Rafael, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. First, double checking that everyone can hear me well. Great. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for everyone joining us from different regions. So what I wanted to talk a little bit more is precisely about a foundational aspect of UN80, which has been the question of budget, as I think was really correctly outlined before. Of course, UN80 captures a lot of political reform or intentions and expectations for political reform, but a lot of it will not necessarily happen if we are in a similar complicated budgetary and liquidity situation. So I'll outline basically and explain what is this situation, how did UN80 contribute to it somehow, and I'll give a little bit of an overview of how that has impacted, but Marianne will delve much more into the different impacts of the financial situation. So as you know, the UN is facing a financial crisis, and that financial crisis has two phases. First, a budgetary crisis, so that's related to the UN's budget, so theoretical budget accepted by member states. And on top of this, also a liquidity or a cash crisis, you can call it whichever, which is related to the amount of cash available for the UN to execute that approved budget. When it comes to the budget, so that everybody understands, the UN operates based on what we call a regular budget or RB. The UN's regular budget covers the budget of the 6 UN principal organs, including the UN Secretariat and the General Assembly, and all of the Secretariat offices. So that includes the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, or OHCHR. The UN also has a separate budget for peacekeeping operations and for other more specialized agencies, for instance, like the ILO. The UN's regular budget is approved annually and is funded by member states' assessed contributions. So this means the amount of money that is shared among member states to finance the budget approved by the General Assembly according to every member state's capacity to pay. On top of this, states can give voluntary donations to parts of the UN. That's what we call the extra budgetary budget of the UN. For instance, in the case of OHCHR, of the UN's Human Rights Office, the office depends on from 60 to 70% on voluntary donations, which makes it unfortunately very donor reliant. On the other hand, we have then the liquidities, which is basically the cash available to the UN, which depends on states paying and paying on time, but we'll get to this a little bit later. Now, for the UN80 budget cuts, the UN80 budget cuts, so what we call workstream 1, as was outlined just before, followed basically a very similar process as every year that I'm going to oversimplify, but that is important still so you understand what are the different actors that had different positions on the cuts. Normally, for the UN adoption of its budget every year, it starts with the Secretary General, so in this case, Antonio Guterres, who proposes a budget at the beginning of the year that should reflect the needs of the organization for the year after. This proposal then goes to a very technical, opaque, shady advisory body that is called the ACABQ. I'm not going to explain more in detail, but basically it's a body that advises on administrative and financial issues where members are appointed by states. They're not really independent. And ISHR issued a report actually in November last year showing how this body has consistently cut human rights budgets more than other budgets at the UN. So the ACABQ reviews the Secretary General's proposal, and then on the basis of this ACABQ report, member states negotiate at the General Assembly and adopt a budget usually a few days before the end of the year in late December. In the context of UN80, this was a little bit different because usually the Secretary General asks for more money and then he gets cut. But this year, the Secretary General already included cuts in his own proposal. So cuts precisely to address and what he calls seeking efficiencies. So, basically trying to save money and save costs within the existing budget, just for the sake of seeking diminishing the budget. And so the Secretary General proposed a cut of 15% to the UN's overall regular budget, which includes an 18% reduction in the number of permanent posts, so permanent staff posts at the UN, whether they're vacant or not. For the UN Human Rights Office, the OHCHR, that meant cutting 105 posts in that original UN80 budget proposal by the Secretary General. Now, the ACABQ, this body that I just talked about, reviewed this, and on top of this, for human rights, added an additional 11% in post reductions for the UN Human Rights Office. So that was a 12 additional posts to be cut, which brings the total to 117, which is a lot. A fundamental problem in UN80 was the mindset that was adopted for those budget reductions. So everyone was looking at how much money was getting saved or how much posts were being lost compared to the year before, and not against what are the actual needs of the UN for 2026 to implement its obligations, its mandates that were agreed by member states. So in a nutshell, the discussion was purely based on cost saving and not really on needs. Now, very briefly, when all this reached the member states at the Fifth Committee, because of a lack of time to negotiate, because states that usually support human rights budgets didn't have a lot of leverage because they had to support the overall reform effort. And because overall member states had radically different positions on human rights and couldn't reach a consensus, what everybody landed on was just to accept whatever the Secretary General and the ACBQ had set for human rights specifically. So they just accepted that those cuts that I just outlined. So to oversimplify again, we had on one hand Western countries, EU countries without the US, as well as a group of Latin American countries that opposed the cuts and supported human rights budgets. And for the first time, and that's notable, they were supported by newcomers from the Africa and Asia Pacific group, which traditionally doesn't really stand up for human rights budgets. And these included small countries like Cape Verde, Mauritius, and the Maldives. The US did not support, but also did not oppose budgets. They remained silent, which ended up being somehow helpful and perhaps the least worst case scenario. While the G77, which is the big influential group of nearly all developing countries where China has a lot of influence, pushed for a few more cuts, but there was still internal damage control, I think, in terms of what it could have been. Thanks to Latin American countries. And that means that almost all the very extreme proposals to cut human rights budgets came as usual from China, Russia, and Belarus. These group of countries also tried to force a vote to defund a wide range of Human Rights Council resolutions that would actually target them, as they have tried previous years. And as for previous years, it failed by a large margin. Now, what is really concerning is this very strongly disproportionate impact on the human rights pillar compared to other pillars. So the budget cuts in the Secretary General's original proposal disproportionately targeted the human rights pillar with 15% proposed cuts compared to, for instance, 11.7% for the development pillar of the UN. You will know that the UN has 3 pillars: peace and security, sustainable development, and human rights. And here, human rights was more targeted than other pillars, despite promises by the Secretary General to safeguard human rights budgets and ensure balance across the pillars. This exacerbates the gap that exists between the UN 3 pillars, as the human rights one has traditionally only received around 5 to 6% of the UN's budget every year, which is extremely low, despite being very efficient as a pillar already and delivering a lot with a few budget. In addition to this, the UN Human Rights Office has a very limited capacity to absorb cuts because of the nature of its work, and because year after year, member states ask and expect the UN Human Rights Office to do more, to investigate more, of course, because the crises are growing and growing, but does not give a proportionate budget for this. So that means you should do more and more with the same budget or just slightly more, which creates this really big gap and makes it more vulnerable. This is amplified by the fact that member states have reduced over the last 2 years a lot their voluntary donations to the Human Rights Office. So it is really, really strained in its capacity and has to pull its internal capacity to address those cuts, but there's no reserve anymore. This also, an important data point is to put in context, is that the cuts to human rights only contributed to less than 10% of UN80 cost-saving efforts. Now, very concretely, the majority of the cuts in positions, because most of the human rights work is staff, it's actually human resources. The majority of the cuts in the UN Human Rights Office targeted its Global Operations Division, which basically covers country situations and engagement with countries, followed by its research and thematic work. And only then, to a lesser extent, there were cuts also to the office's support to specific human rights bodies. So the treaty bodies, the Human Rights Council, the UPR, and the special procedures. States also only agreed to create half of the 25 posts that were asked to implement new resolutions adopted by the Human Rights Council last year. This included the vast majority of those new posts includes posts for the new independent mechanism on Afghanistan, which investigates atrocity crimes in Afghanistan. And other resolution that received a very small number of posts includes resolutions on the rights of older persons, on economic, social, and cultural rights, and on sea level rise. But for instance, the resolution on access to vaccines did not get any post. Now, this affects in particular vacancies. 99 of the 117 are cuts to posts that were not yet created or that are vacant as a result of a hiring freeze. And this hiring freeze exists for now over 2 years because of the UN cash crisis. There is no cash, the UN has to save money, and so it has frozen any hiring of staff. That means that all the recent Human Rights Council resolutions that were adopted, most of them have a lot of vacancies. So that means that the cuts by UN80 overwhelmingly affect recent Human Rights Council resolutions. And that, against some ideas, does not only affect civil and political rights or country investigations, it also affects economic, social, and cultural rights, the right of development, and other important priorities for the Global South. And this, of course, hampers the ability of the UN to assist states in revising laws and policies, in improving governance, in training officials, as well as its ability to monitor and document and investigate grave human rights violations. This is, again, as I was saying, exacerbated by the reduction in voluntary donations, which has made the system very reliant on the few donors now that it has. One positive aspect before talking about the cash crisis that managed to survive the UN80 process is the fact that the states and the other bodies involved in the budget accepted the Secretary General's proposal to redeploy 71 posts to the UN Human Rights Office's regional presences, so regional offices, and to create 2 director positions in their Bangkok and Beirut offices, which elevates the UN's human rights presence in those regions, despite attempts by countries like Iran or China to oppose this closer presence to their countries. This is part of the OACHR's, what we call the regionalization strategy, to boost this presence on the ground. Russia, for instance, also tried to oppose the creation of a new UN Human Rights Office in Vienna for Europe and Central Asia, unsuccessfully. Now, to conclude with the liquidity crisis, I'll try to go slightly faster on this. But on top of all these issues to the theoretical budget, we have a problem of cash. So that means that the UN can only execute its agreed budget if all states pay their full share of the approved budget and if they pay on time. But the UN is undergoing a very severe liquidity or cash crisis since 2024, which means even before UN80 started. And this is because states are not paying their contributions, their obligatory contributions in full, and they're not paying on time. So before 2025, before last year, the main problem was states that were paying late. And we're telling you this because that might be the case of the country in which you're in. And we need advocacy on this. So the main problem was states paying late, which meant that they paid either very late in the year or sometimes the year after. To give an example, on average, only about 150 states pay their dues by the end of the year. And the US, who is the biggest contributor, 22% of the budget, traditionally pays late, around October. China, who has grown a lot in its share of the budget from a few percentage to 15 to, since last year, 20% of the regular budget, so almost like the US, has paid also later and later. And we have this extreme example in 2024, where China paid on 27 December, which is 4 days before the year at the end of the year. Why is this so important? First, because it's a cash flow issue. This means that if everyone pays its share at the end, the UN does not have actual cash throughout the year to be paying salaries and to be covering their costs. And this is why since 2024, they adopted a series of drastic cash saving measures. Again, I was talking about the hiring freeze, and Marianne will talk a little bit more about the reduction of meeting times, for instance, and the impact for human rights. The second problem about paying very late is that under a very obscure UN financial rule, all the money that the UN cannot spend by the end of the year is obliged to be returned to all member states according to their share of the budget. This meant, for instance, for this year in 2026, that on top of all the budget cuts to the UN, the UN had to return over $200 million to member states because China had paid on 27 December 2 years ago. Takes 2 years. As we just said, and the UN couldn't spend that money in 4 days. And in December, the member states adopted a slight change to that rule that reduced that cash to be returned back by a quarter, but the states failed to adopt a full suspension of this financial rule, despite very strong calls to do so by the Secretary General and civil society, including us. And we will push states this year to still do so. Now, and to conclude with this, the big issue, of course, and the elephant in the room is that since last year, on top of states paying late, we have a huge issue, which is the US not paying at all under the Trump administration. The US now owes over 95% of the cash that the UN is due, which is about $1.5 billion, which, to put into perspective, is only 1 day of US spendings related to its aggression of Iran. And while the US has said that it has paid a few $100 million this year, it still owes a lot of money. So the big question is if and how much the US will pay this year. And the only thing that can help us plan is that Article 19 of the UN Charter says that a state that accumulates 2 years in arrears of the money that it owes, so the equivalent of 2 years in what it owes to the UN, loses its voting rights to the General Assembly. So this year, either the US loses those rights or pays the sufficient amount of money to be just below that threshold, which gives us some predictability. And the problem is that so far, the UN all agencies only have received 20% of the adopted budget because of the liquidity situation. That includes the UN Human Rights Office. And with only that small percentage of cash, it's still not enough to pay and to predict that they can pay salaries for the rest of the year. They can only tell their staff, we're going to pay you until, say, the end of April or the end of May. And of course, they cannot hire new staff. I'll leave it there.
Mathilde, do you want? Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Sorry, I was trying to find control of my microphone. Thanks so much, Raphael. Thanks, Jibison, for this very, very rich introductory sessions. So we have now time, space for you participants to raise questions. You can use for that the chat box or the Q&A box that is available on Zoom. So if you want to raise questions, please feel free to provide them in the chat box. Let me see if I can stop sharing screen. Yes, so I can see the chat. I see there's one question already. Are civil society included in the budget? I guess the question means whether a portion of the UN's yearly budget is dedicated to civil society in some shape or form. Who would like to take this question? Raphael, do you want to come in?
Sure. I think that if we talk about human rights, there's 2 ways to understand this question. How the UN Human Rights Office works on civil society space and how the UN enables civil society participation in UN human rights bodies. So both are different parts of the engagement with civil society, and there is budget for both, let's say. So the UN Human Rights Office has a section that works on civil society space, and that does research and that produces information and engages with states, and they have a budget for that, including to implement resolutions that were adopted by the Human Rights Council. There's a resolution on civil society space that requires a certain budget to be implemented because it requires a report, etc. And separately, there are all the different all UN bodies have different modalities for civil society engagement. In human rights field, it's very open, as you probably know. In other fields, it's much more restricted. But basically, every single UN entity has a budget for conference management and everything related to the participation of all stakeholders in different meetings, etc. So when it comes, for instance, to the Human Rights Council or the treaty bodies, there is a specific part of there's some budget allocated to ensure participation of civil society as requested and mandated. But then UN80 has impacted budgets overall, so that affects everyone, both, for instance, the research on civil society, but also the ability for civil society to participate in those meetings. And Marianne will talk a little bit more about that in detail.
Thanks, Raphael. And thanks, Dos, for the very, very spot on question. Any other question from the participants? No? Okay. So then, oh, I see one is coming up. Is the UN becoming more reliant on earmarked donor funding with this new initiative, or how would that affect independence?
If I come in, that's an
Yeah,
excellent
Raphael.
question. Thank you so much. There is a risk. I mean, so let me tell the every single part of the UN is a little bit different and works a little bit different. So some parts, for instance, the High Commissioner, the High Commissioner for Refugees receives a lot of voluntary donations. Over 90%, I think, of its budget depends on states giving whatever they want to give. So their share of the regular budget is very small. For the UN Human Rights Office, the voluntary donations have traditionally been around 60 to 70%. That's partly because, from the regular budget that is often cut, it is not sufficient to actually address the needs of the UN Human Rights Office. So there's always been some form of dependence on voluntary donations. And then, you can decide whether you think that this will create some challenges to independence. Definitely, I mean, there's been, I think in general, concerns that, major powers might have influence, and that the UN Human Rights Office might be more reluctant to speak on countries like, for instance, the US, but also China, particular to that effect, because of a fear of jeopardizing funding. The other part of your question is related to earmark. So this is important. Out of those voluntary donations, traditionally, I would say, I'm not quite sure, but I think that a little bit less than half have been unearmarked. So basically, this is just money that member states give to the office and say, we trust you in using this money, which is good because it gives flexibility to the office, and it just funds the ability of the UN to do its work. Now, more and more states, including traditional Western donors, have moved more towards earmarked funding. So basically funding only their priorities. And that is a problem because then you're overfunding, not overfunding, but you're, supporting more one part of the office, which even if that part is doing a good job, this is in spite of another part, which is being underfunded, and that creates kind of like imbalances. And that may affect indeed perceptions of independence. Now, the last thing is the share of the regular budget. So even if the share in itself, states cannot influence it. So, in 2018, Trump had said, I'm removing my regular budget contribution to OECHR. You cannot do that. You send your money to the UN, and then the UN allocates that money to the different agencies. You can do it symbolically if you want, but that actually the UN doesn't care about your declaration. But one thing that the organization overall has become very member state dependent on two member states. We're talking a lot about the US, but if China tomorrow decides not to pay, both together are 42% of the UN's regular budget. There's always been a reliance on the US, which has been at 22% of the budget for a very long time. But China has grown a lot, again, from a few percent at the beginning of the 2000s to 15% to now 20%. So actually their behavior has changed also in negotiations because they realize now they have a behavior of a major donor. So all this makes an organization overly reliant on those two member states that, of course, don't really get well along. And there's a risk overall for the Human Rights Office that states instrumentalize the questions of funding being regular and being voluntary to really change in a surgical manner, and advance in a surgical manner their priorities to the Human Rights Office. And I'll just finish with one example, sorry. Last year in negotiations, there's a specific negotiation in New York about the budget that is required to implement all the new Human Rights Council resolutions adopted last year. I mentioned it regarding Afghanistan and all this thematic work. In that resolution, basically Latin American and Western states without the US strongly pushed for full funding for those new resolutions. And the only country that actually was opposing all funding for all the resolutions was China, saying, we don't want to fund any of this. We are not. And what was interesting is that they were saying for all these resolutions, there shouldn't be more funding because X, Y, and Z, bad argument. And then they still managed to carve out two exceptions. And they said, actually, there's only two resolutions that we want to fund that we're not going to tell you why, but I will let you guess. These are the two resolutions that China pushes at the Human Rights Council, which are on their two priorities. So that shows you how states are trying to use budget to still exert their influence.
Thanks so much, Raphael. Very interesting again. Jefferson, do you still want to come in?
Yeah, agree with what Raphael said, but wanted to bring attention to this part. It's not only about voluntary contributions being earmarked, but also if we carefully analyze how the assessed contributions are working. Recently, the US does not want the UN to use the regular funding for certain agencies. That is also a form of earmarking, although it is not said earmarking. If you carefully analyze, some of these agencies will not get the funding, regular budget. That practice needs to be severely opposed, because if US starts doing it, then all other countries can say, okay, my regular budget assessed contributions you don't use for this, which effectively makes the assessed contribution and the regular budget also a form of earmark contributions. The second point was slightly touched by Raphael on the approval of posts. That also, if we carefully take a step back and analyze, that is also earmarking. So although you create your mandates, you create offices, if those are not funded, although it's not said earmarking, it's in effect earmarking no fund for that work. So these practices have been happening for some times. The UN is becoming more and more dependent on this earmarking, or in effect earmarking practices by member states. Back to you. Over.
Thanks, Jefferson. Yeah, very good point. Thanks, Young, again for the question. And I see there's a few more, but some of those questions will be addressed in the next session. So why don't we move on and hand over to you, Marianne, for the next session. And we keep those questions in the chat for later if some of them have not been addressed. There will be another opportunity for us to discuss and raise different questions. Thank you. Over to you, Marianne.
Thank you, Mathilde. So I will talk a little bit of the impacts that we already see on mainly on human rights mechanisms. So the impacts that I'm going to describe here are consequences of the liquidity crisis that precedes UN80, but they were hugely amplified by the UN80 budget cuts. So first, I want to address the impact on civil society access and participation to engage with UN human rights mechanisms. What we have seen is that the practice to have online interventions, pre-recorded videos, especially for people who cannot attend in-person sessions of the Human Rights Council or other human rights mechanisms, and this practice was implemented during COVID, has been really eroding since 2024 because the UN office in Geneva now requires states and civil society to pay for the use of their WebEx system. This is like the online conferencing tool that they use, and for interpretation booth. So the impact is that only very few informal consultations, so these meetings where resolutions are negotiated, have been made available online via WebEx. And of course, it means less human rights defenders and able to engage, but also less small states, especially from Global South, to engage. Then there is a second consequence that at least they have been trying to do that, which is to cut the accessibility service, such as international sign language interpretation and captioning at the beginning of the year, including for a session of the Committee on the Rights of People with Disabilities. But this was, at the moment, that has been reversed after a letter from the president of the Human Rights Council. So we will see how this continues. Then on the agreed restructuring and budgetary crisis are also affecting the functioning of the different human rights mechanisms in the UN. So for the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, we know that in 2025, 300 jobs were lost. And of course, that had also a consequence for the human rights activities that the office delivers. So in 2025, the office was unable to deliver 17 thematic activities mandated by the Human Rights Council. And others were delivered, but in a reduced form. So that means that many meetings, panels were organized, but with less people invited. Some of them were online instead of in person. No interpretation was provided, and the related reports were not done. I wanted to give one specific example in the field. So in Honduras, for instance, there were fewer workshops with less participants organized on technical cooperation and capacity building on the penitentiary system, security and justice. And so the impact, like a very concrete impact, was that there was more limited progress on establishing an agreement between the judicial power, the Attorney General's office, and the Security Secretariat to improve the investigation and sanction of crimes committed against women. Authorities had less opportunities to learn about and choose other models for prison management based on international human rights standards. And then key outputs were not delivered or incompletely delivered, including a human rights focused prison management plan, a complaints protocol, a guide for police to have procedures with a human rights perspective, and so on and so on. No? For 2026, we know that at least 9 more activities won't be delivered by the OHCHR, and that includes a Secretary General study on the inclusion of persons with disabilities, several reports on menstrual hygiene, the representation of women and girls in human rights mechanisms, cyberbullying versus older persons. Also, panels won't be organized on local government and human rights, another one on domestic violence. We know that one report and a dialogue within the Human Rights Council won't happen on human rights and the internet. Same for 5 regional workshops on the safety of children and the internet, and 2 workshops and reports on the culture of peace. And some other activities from 2024 will only start in 2026, so with a lot of delay, and in a reduced form, and if the 2026 budget allotment allows that. And that touches on several, like many issues like racism, girls' rights, and the 2030 agenda. So that's for the office. Then for the field presence and regional offices of OHCHR, we know that in 2025, less than half the number of human rights monitoring missions happened in comparison to in 2024. Less human rights advisors were deployed to UN country teams, and the UN had to close offices or significantly reduce their presence in 17 countries, including Colombia, Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, Guinea, Myanmar, DRC, and Chad. So, of course, concretely, that means less support for transitional justice processes, less technical assistance to government, and of course, less protection to human rights defenders and communities. At the level of the Human Rights Council in 2025, and we know that this has been prolonged for 2026, the duration of sessions will be reduced by at least 10%. So it means less time to speak. The interactive dialogues, which are like the sessions where NGOs can take the floor as well, will be shorter. So less NGOs will get speaking slots. And there will be reduced funding and staffing for the team dealing with the Universal Periodic Review. So countries' UPRs might be pushed or delayed over the year. On investigative mechanisms, so when I say investigative mechanisms, those are like the fact-finding missions, the commission of inquiries that are mandated by the Human Rights Council. In 2025, they had to scale back investigations and because of that and restrict hiring. So their staffing was limited to 50 to 60%, and that deprived them of essential expertise. On top of that, the majority of staff working in there are on temporary contracts, and so are increasingly being forced to separate. So that means that they have observed a loss of institutional knowledge and expertise. These reduce, like scaling back of investigation mean less interviews, less research, less evidence gathered. So two specific examples, the Commission of Inquiry on Eastern DRC could not start working. OECHR was forced to advertise the positions unfunded. I believe in 2026 now they will be able to hire people, but of course, like the presentation of the first comprehensive reports that the commission was meant to present will be delayed. The Commission of Inquiry on Israel and Palestine was also unable to implement its reporting mandates on the transfer or sale of arms to Israel. These mandates have now expired, so unless the Human Rights Council reaches a new decision and hiring freeze is lifted, this won't be implemented. On treaty bodies now, in 2025, we saw a 30% reduction of meeting times, and that has the consequence is that there are 39 state party reviews delayed. Several sessions were cancelled, for example, the Committee Against Torture, the Human Rights Committee, or shortened. So that means that fewer country situations were examined every year. CAT postponed 6 country situations, for instance, and the Committee on Rights of Migrant Workers, 35. Delays in process, it means also delays in processing individual communications. For instance, CEDAW could not adopt decisions on 85 individual communications. Also, the committees with visiting mandates had half of their country visits postponed. For 2026, we already know that CEDAW, CSR, the Human Rights Committee, the Committee on Enforced Disappearance, and the CRPD will shorten their sessions by 1 or 1.5 weeks. And in January 2026, the backlog of reports to be reviewed totaled 332. On special procedures, so they had they are now able only to do 1 country visit instead of 2 country visits per year. So that means less opportunity, of course, for the experts to engage with authorities and civil society. The working groups had to reduce their sessions of 1/3 or more. So it means less decisions or follow-up made on individual cases. As an example, the working groups on enforced disappearance has currently a backlog of around 8,000 cases and weren't able to run visits to any country in 2025. The Special Rapporteur on Peaceful Assembly and Association couldn't deliver a global consultation on peaceful protest in 2025, and we know that they won't be able to do that in 2026. And the special rapporteur on Russia had to reduce the number of participants, including civil society, in their consultations. And last but not least, on the third committee, which is like this space at the General Assembly that where human rights reporting can be done, in 2025, discussions of each agenda item was replaced by a single general debate. And the statements were limited. Some experts could not travel to New York to present their report and their findings. So that means that there is a more limited reporting on human rights in New York at a time where there is a growing pressure by a group of states, especially from the African regional group, to reduce reporting of special procedures to the third committee. Yes, I think I will leave it there and give the floor now to Rafael on what we can now expect.
Thank you so much, Marianne, and it's great to also see a lot of questions in the chat that I'm going to also try to address in the last part that should be hopefully less long. And I also see that there's a question in the chat about if we can share the numbers of the implications of budget cuts available. So we will share in the chat our analysis of the outcomes of the negotiations in New York. They give you an overview, and it's basically a summary of what I presented before, and separately a landing page where ISHR put up, and that is compiling all the publicly available information that maps the impact of the budget cuts and the liquidity crisis on all human rights mechanisms. So basically an extended version and more detailed version of what Marianne has just shared, and we'll share this in the chat. Now, if I can just come back to then what's coming, and a little bit of it has already been initially shared by our colleagues from C4UN. The first thing is to come back to the other work streams. So setting aside now the budget and coming back to the work streams 3 and 2, so basically related to reform and mandate review proposals. If we go back to the human rights group, as our colleagues were explaining, that the reform proposals in the form of those work packages were adopted, were, like I say, agreed and proposed by the Secretary General and are being implemented. Only one of them deals directly with human rights, which is the establishment of a human rights group. Some others are linked to the human rights work. So you will have heard, as was mentioned just before, about the merger of UN Women with UNFPA or the sunsetting of UN80. But I will focus for, let's say, the only explicit human rights proposal, which is the establishment of a human rights group. And I should say that some people were unhappy that the reforms were not more ambitious, given all the ideas that there existed to reform the human rights pillar. But others were actually thought that in the current context of a lot of hostility against human rights, this perhaps was the best case scenario in which we only have one recommendation that does not undermine the system itself and adds on more coordination, basically. So this proposal by the Secretary General reads exactly as: establish a human rights group comprising entities from across the UN system to be led by the High Commissioner for Human Rights. So this proposal was sent by the Secretary General and made public, and now it is in the hands of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk, for its conceptualization and to put this group together. In November, and ahead of a meeting with UN all top-level officials of the UN, where they were going to decide on how to implement all the reform proposals, ISHR sent a letter to the Secretary General and the High Commissioner based on a previous joint NGO letter that we had sent in the summer with concrete proposal with regards to the human rights group. The first one is that the human rights group should ensure that civil society is consulted in the process of establishing it. The group should also ensure a UN system-wide response to and to act on early warning signals that come from national and global civil society, national human rights institutions, and UN country offices. That the human rights group ensure the independence of independent human rights bodies, so that is the special procedures and the country-specific investigative mechanisms created by the Human Rights Council. that are supported but independent from OHCHR. And for that purpose, that the human rights group should include in the group also, and on top of the High Commissioner, other human rights voices, and that includes the chair of the Special Procedures Coordination Committee and the chair of the treaty body chairs. And lastly, but importantly, related to civil society, we recommended that the human rights group should include senior representatives from independent civil society, or at minima establish a civil society advisory committee. Now, what do we currently know? And I have to say that there's a lot that we don't necessarily know, and that is one of the issues of the human rights group. What we know so far is that the human rights group will be constituted of principals only, so heads of UN agencies and departments, and is now someone in place and chaired by the High Commissioner, who is preparing terms of reference. We as civil society are trying soon to engage with the High Commissioner to learn more about this and ensure that civil society voices again are heard in these establishments. This human rights group mostly emanates from the Pact for the Future, for those that follow this, and for the promises to build up and further mainstream the human rights across the UN ecosystem. And as we understand right now, the human rights group aims at being some sort of like more or less regular meeting. So say a few times a year, probably not more, of top UN officials to ensure a consistent and coordinated response of the UN system on human rights, and translate this on the ground with UN country teams and resident coordinators who previously may have disregarded human rights a little bit more. So a more united, coherent, cohesive voice for the UN human rights work across different agencies. So not to silo it only for human rights, but across UN agencies, development, peace and security, and in particular, not only in headquarters, but on the ground by country teams. And this somehow, builds up actually and implements previous initiatives by Secretary General, such as Human Rights Upfront, for those of you that have followed this in the past. Now, if I can switch to mandate review, so this is workstream 2, perhaps just as a clarification for those that are confused about this use of word, when we refer to mandates in this context, and to simplify a lot, we're basically referring to concrete activities or actions that are mandated by resolutions, and this can create that can range from the establishment of a special rapporteur to requesting a report to convening a meeting. All these are understood as mandates, so activities that are mandated by resolutions and that very often generate budget requirements. Now, as our colleagues were saying before, there's been a long process in New York to engage with states and to some very small extent civil society that was led by 2 co-chairs of an informal working group. So that was New Zealand and Jamaica, as was said, and to collect inputs from all states on the best practices related to the creation. So the whole mandate life cycle, its creation, its implementation, and its review / its sunsetting. So there were a lot of briefings in New York, bringing UN and external experts up until December. And then in January, the 2 co-chairs released a first draft resolution that captured all these inputs. States then negotiated based on these inputs from again, and the working group released a revised draft in March, early March, that from our perspective was an improvement from various aspects, although it did channel a lot of what originally were expectations placed on the Secretary General. They channeled it to member states, so it made it more intergovernmental. And then the working groups received inputs again, states negotiated again, and now the working group proposed a few days back, as was said, a nearly final draft that we expect to be adopted. So the first draft, ISHR had led an NGO joint submission that highlighted 2 key points. First, the specificities of human rights mandates that need to be taken into account to avoid the standardized review approach to all UN mandates. And these specificities may include the fact that mandates very often are negotiated very fast to react fast to emerging crises, the need to consult affected communities, the length sometimes and the protracted length of mandates that is because they are asked to address root causes, and we don't solve this, of course, in a few years. And basically to understand how human rights cannot be quantified, the impact the same way, for instance, that you can for humanitarian, where it is the amount of aid that you're delivering in terms of food or medical care or other. And the second important point that we made in that submission was to say that civil society is a key stakeholder in the implementation often of mandates, and so therefore needs to be fully involved in the whole cycle of the mandates, the creation, the implementation, and the review of those mandates. Now, the current nearly adopted draft, and we should put up a public piece about this in the coming days, whenever it's adopted, basically, outlines a range of commitments for states to uphold in the creation, implementation, and review of mandates. So it's mostly political commitments. So states will have to decide whether they actually comply with those commitments or not. It does mandate obligatory then a review of existing mandates, including General Assembly mandates, and this will include the Human Rights Council as a subsidiary organ to the General Assembly. As was said before, we understand that there are some exceptions to which mandates should be reviewed, and depending on how that gets interpreted by states, that might actually safeguard and exempt some human rights mandates, and maybe even some country situations from this review. So this is something that we hope, but it's still pretty much up in the air and will depend on states. And this creates, it also mandates the Secretary General to review a lot of its reports, to assist states in this review effort and to develop new digital tools that some of them hopefully are already available to us, and some others should be more, we will try to make sure that they're not only available for states. And it creates then, it establishes formally a working group on mandate review that will be co-chaired by 2 states to be still appointed, that will resume work in May. And this is the place where states will consider all proposals for reviews of existing mandates and will adopt criteria to guide the creation, review, and sunsetting of future mandates. Now, our remaining concerns are that it's still a very state-centric review process. So with everything that this means and the need to look up that states don't instrumentalize it, and to, in particular, to cut overly fragile human rights mandates. Civil society participation, the modalities for civil society participation remain undefined and unclear. We understand that in the text, there's references to other stakeholders. So this is what we're going to have to hold on to ensure that we participate and our voices are included. And there is a risk that a standardized approach to all mandates overlooks the specificities of human rights mandates, in particular entailing risks for country-specific investigative mechanisms. Although I have to say that in the negotiations, a lot of states have highlighted, and even the co-chairs have highlighted that it's not a one-size-fits-all approach, and every mandate, of course, is different. Now, the next steps in this review process and timeline is, we have to still wait for this text to be fully adopted, but as our colleague was saying, I don't necessarily think there's going to change much. And we need to make sure the civil society is involved and embedded in all those different review processes, and that includes also in the work of this new working group. And in doing so, we'll have to ensure that member states and the UN Secretariat always bear in mind and take into full account the needs and specificities of human rights mandates when they are talking about creation, review, sunsetting, etc. And just to make sure that I also address the questions that we already had. Yeah, and so just on the point about engagement with civil society, for the human rights reform, for the human rights group 1, sorry, there was not really a process for civil society engagement. We decided to submit proposals to the Secretary General and the High Commissioner on ideas for reforms of the human rights pillar. And then when we knew it was a human rights group, we sent specific proposals for this human rights group. There's not a formal engagement track for civil society, if I should say. And also not for states. And I'll get back to this because there's a tension on the perception that this is really driven by the Secretary General alone. And for work stream 3, I have to say the co-chairs were very clear that civil society could send inputs. We sent inputs, a range of groups sent inputs for the different draft revisions. And they were also, they held a consultation with civil society to answer questions and also gather inputs in New York, although it was a little bit rushed, I have to say. And I think they have to be reminded to still, not just do this as a one-off, but actually engage with us. But I would say that there's been some degree of openness from the co-chairs, and we hope that this is something that remains. And I'll just close with a very brief kind of like mapping of tensions that exist politically. So the first tension, again, is that states are perceiving that this whole UN80 reform effort is really secretariat-led, and that states are not adequately consulted or informed. And so therefore, they want to be more informed and consult, and they want this process to be more state-owned and intergovernmental, hence the changes in the draft resolutions on mandate review that we said. Before, mostly it was states like Russia pushing for this to be more state-centric, but now more and more states want to have more ownership of the process. This also happens in a broader context where there are pushes in Geneva, but in particular in New York by many countries, in particular from the Africa Group and others that are traditionally hostile to human rights like China, Russia, Egypt, Pakistan, Saudi, the UAE, to use both the existing review process, but also the broader momentum of reform to advance arguments in favor of mandate review with a view to reducing the reporting of special rapporteurs to the General Assembly. That's a discussion that is already happening in Geneva, and those cuts are already happening. And further isolate human rights discussions only in Geneva, so really siloing human rights. Also to try to merge or end very important mandates or reduce how periodic they are. And also attack country-specific investigations or other thematic human rights mandates that are deemed more sensitive, like those on gender, on LGBTI rights, or for instance, the Secretary General's report on reprisals against those who cooperate with the UN. States have shifted a little bit in their influence, but roughly it's what I had outlined before, where you have mostly EU Western states without the US and Latin American states, I mean the progressive ones, supporting human rights progress, but they all also have other priorities in other pillars, and including ensuring that the overall reform effort is successful. Other Global South voices actually will prioritize other parts of the UN, such as, for instance, development. And then we have, Russia, China, and other like-minded that are clearly opposed to human rights and are using this opportunity to undermine independence and funding. I'm oversimplifying. There's much more nuance to this, but this is just to give you a mapping. And I'll close with the importance of leveraging coalitions. And this is really important when you're talking about an effort of UN reform in a context where we have great power exerting influence. There are existing coalitions, such as the Mexico and Norway UN80 Global Initiative that was launched last year by Mexico and Norway, and that gathers those two plus Jordan, Indonesia, Kenya, New Zealand, and Singapore. But there are also, this addresses UN80 overall, not specific to human rights. But we really need, and this is something that ISHR is strongly investing efforts in, to build a new coalition on human rights specifically, that is able to advance more progressive positions in a cross-regional manner at the UN, including at UN80. And this could build on initiatives that have already existed. In Geneva, we had a joint statement last year by Chile to ensure adequate human rights funding that was delivered at the Human Rights Council and supported by 41 governments. And a major milestone that ISHR worked hard with states to initiate and to achieve was a joint statement adopted at the beginning of March and now supported by 91 states, which includes pledges to defend human rights multilateralism. And that includes to defend human rights mandates during UN80 reform, civil society participation, enhance the Human Rights Council's work, and prioritize securing adequate funding for the human rights pillar. And this is something that we'd like to work off of and build a kind of like a real coalition to articulate proposals and mobilize really cross-regional support, in particular from the Global South, and bring this specifically from Geneva to New York, because this is where most of, if not all of those discussions are happening. Sorry, I took a long time, but maybe I'll leave it here and I address some questions already.
Thank you, Rafael. I just want, before we open the floor to more questions, and you can start already typing your questions if you have, to share some considerations, notes sent by Renata Giuliotti, who works at GLEDES, which is one of the partners that organized this webinar, and who's based in Brazil. So this is why she couldn't be here today, because of the time difference. So I'm going to read her remarks, which are about transparency and engagement. And she says, as we reflect on UN80 and the actors and stakeholders involved in this process, we must recognize that the success of UN reform will depend not only on institutional adjustments, but on the quality, inclusiveness, and equity of participation it enables. UN80 presents a critical opportunity to move beyond a predominantly state-centric model and to advance a truly whole-of-society approach. This requires the meaningful and sustained engagement of civil society, grassroots organizations, and historically marginalized groups, including people of African descent, indigenous peoples, persons with disabilities, women, and youth. While existing entry points for participations remain relevant, UN80 must place stronger emphasis on the actors and stakeholders involved in the process and on expanding opportunities for meaningful engagement. The effectiveness of this reform will depend on how inclusively it brings together civil society, grassroots actors, and historically marginalized communities as active contributors. This requires moving beyond ad hoc and consultative approaches toward systematic, continuous, and accessible engagement opportunities that enable stakeholders to shape priorities, inform decision-making, and co-create solutions. Strengthening these opportunities is essential to ensure that UN80 is not only participatory in form, but genuinely inclusive in substance, enhancing both the legitimacy and impacts of its outcomes. To mention some of these mechanisms, while major groups and other stakeholders' coordination mechanisms remains a key entry point, it is important to acknowledge and strengthen complementary participation spaces across the UN system. And she mentions here ECOSOC-accredited NGOs and their engagement, civil society participation in the high-level political forum, the UN Global Compact multi-stakeholder platform, UN regional forum and commissions, thematic mechanisms within human rights spaces, like those we mentioned before, but also informal mechanisms such as ad hoc civil society working groups and stakeholders coalitions, who also play a critical role in shaping agendas and advancing accountability. However, for these spaces to be truly effective, engagement must be institutionalized, accessible, and accountable, and participation should move beyond consultation toward co-creation, shared agenda setting, and measurable influence on outcomes. In this regard, she sent a few guiding questions for our collective reflection. Who is currently shaping the UN80 process and who remains absent or underrepresented? How are different participation mechanisms, formal and informal, being connected, or are they operating in silos? At what stage are stakeholders being engaged, early design, implementation, or only validation? What structural barriers such as visa restriction, digital divides, language access, and financial constraints continue to limit equitable participation, particularly for stakeholders from the Global South? What accountability mechanisms exist to ensure that stakeholders' inputs meaningfully inform decision? And how do we ensure that participation redistributes power rather than simply broadens consultation? Addressing these questions requires concrete steps, establishing minimum standards for inclusive participation, aligned with the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy, strengthening hybrid and multilingual modalities, ensuring coherence across participation mechanisms, and investing in disaggregated data systems to track who is participating and who is still left behind. Ultimately, meaningful stakeholder engagement is not only a procedural requirement, but also central to the legitimacy, equity, and effectiveness of UN80. If this process is to deliver transformative change, it must not only reform structures, but also redefine participation, ensuring that those most affected by global challenges are recognized as co-creators of the solutions we urgently need. And I think we agree with that, and that was one of the main calls also made by ISHR and partners when we started engaging with the UN80 process. So over to you, Mathilde.
Thank you so much, Marianne. And thank you again, Raphael, for those very rich, very enlightening, although very heavy as well, presentations. I believe we do have a lot of more questions in the chat. Let me stop sharing screen and see which ones haven't been addressed yet. Okay, we've got one question on how civil society organizations are being included in UN80 reform discussions. I think this has been addressed and specifically about the budget decisions in this process. Do you have any comment on specifically participation of civil society in budget-related discussions? Any of you, I don't know, Raphael or Jebelson?
I mean, very simply, there's been none. Just to say, I mean, the budget process is extremely opaque, and that's something. This is why we published our report last year to try to like democratize a little bit more access and information about budget proceedings in New York. But it was part of like the ongoing. The UN80 budget cuts took the form of, again, the yearly budget process that the UN has, which again is extremely opaque and basically decided between the Secretariat, this body called the ACABQ, which is highly problematic and opaque, and member states that negotiate through some delegates that only work on this in New York. So, you know, the space for I mean, there was never an intention to meet with civil society whatsoever, and let alone to be consulted. And again, a lot of it started with the Secretary General actually proposing budget cuts at the outset. And this is also not something where civil society was engaged whatsoever. This is just the Secretariat saying, we want to cut money for the sake of cutting money, and we're imposing on everyone to cut 15%. Well, some more for some, less for others. And this is how you're going to do it.
Thanks, Raphael. Another question starts with thanking you for the informative webinar. Could you share what concrete steps CSOs can take to engage with the formation of the human rights group and the terms of reference that are being drawn now? Marianne, Raphael?
I can go, but I don't know if our colleagues from C4UN also want to intervene, because I know you wanted before. Sorry, I don't know if you want to go ahead. Otherwise, I'm happy to take that one.
Not on this one. So I'll come back later on the earlier question, but go ahead.
I mean, again, unclear. There's not specific steps because also we just don't know when and how the human rights group will be set up. So what I would recommend actually is not to wait basically for a process or modalities for civil society engagement to be established, but actually to proactively reach out to the actors that we know that are right now thinking about and putting this group together. And that is mostly the High Commissioner for Human Rights. He is the main person that should be hearing, you know, the recommendations that you have for how this human rights group should be established. Now, when it is established, we'll need to see what form does it take, if it's just a few meetings per year or what so. And therefore, push for this engagement with civil society. Again, I mean, if you want to echo this recommendation, but we recommended that, you know, there at least is some sort of advisory committee composed of civil society representatives that can advise that human rights group. But yeah, I mean, aside from right now sharing our proposals and recommendations to the High Commissioner that is leading on this human rights group, there's not much else that we can do until we know what form will this human rights group take, I would say.
Thank you, Raphael. And yes, I mean, knowing a bit what ISHR has been doing, I'm sure you will be kept up to date on any opportunity to engage. So I think if you're not yet part of their newsletters, etc., or in touch with them, I mean, I would highly encourage you to do so, because they are the ones to turn to when it comes to engage on UN80 and human rights, really. C4UN also engages on UN80, but less specifically on human rights. But so if you're not in touch, I think you should definitely engage and that's a good way of staying in the loop when it comes to advocacy, seizing advocacy opportunities. Thanks for the question. There's another comment or question in the Q&A. Jebison, sorry, did you want to come in on this question or the previous one? Sorry.
Yeah, I'll briefly touch on this question as well, and also the earlier question on civil society engagement on budget decisions. As Raphael was saying, the ACABQ is an opaque body, and there are no systematic opportunities for civil society to engage with the budgetary body. That said, irrespective of our advocacy, I don't think that is going to change as well. That is going to remain an opaque and closed body. But what civil society could do is to identify the member states that are member states and the specific people who are part of this body. This is an advisory technical body, and to advocate for specific asks during the budget negotiations. The practice has been the fifth committee of the General Assembly, in most cases, takes the recommendations from the ACABQ. So the decisions are already made at that level. So if civil society can advocate to the specific member states and to the specific people who are part of this opaque ACABQ, I think that could be a more realistic approach. But yeah, this is a personal opinion. I'm not sure how successful that is. And on the question of that is there on the budget from Germany, yes, human rights funding is put up against the other pillars of the UN. There have been many analyses done by ISHR, which has said that human rights funding has been cut more than the other pillars of the UN. And also, traditionally, the human rights pillar has received lesser funding out of whatever the total budget is compared to the other pillars. It is hard to change at this point, but the concrete opportunity that is there is the 2027 regular budget, and the preparations already start in May, June of this month. So the earlier we engage in those budget negotiations, the more successful we could be. And it is also not just our ask, it is also a commitment that have been made by member states in the Pact for the Future for increased and sustainable, predictable funding for the human rights mechanisms. So I think it is a commitment that is already there, and it is our, it should be the duty of member states, but it also falls upon us to hold member states, but also the Secretariat accountable to the commitment that they have made. That's it from my end. Back to.
Thanks, Jebison. Let me read the comment for those of you who may not have seen it, that Jebison was sort of responding to or commenting on. That's in the chat. It says, some feedback we got from politicians and diplomats on our advocacy in Germany. One, advocacy for the human rights funding was seen as competing with other pillars, especially the humanitarian development pillars. And two, especially when talking to conservative politicians, it becomes increasingly counterproductive to mention that Germany is one of the biggest donors to OHCHR, which is indeed a strong illustration of the link between national developments in various democracies across the world and how all of this is impacting multilateralism, and now the UN specifically. Raphael, you want to come in on this?
Yeah, I wanted to build on the really, really good points that Jabilson did and on the comment. Thank you so much, Johannes, for sharing this experience. Yeah, maybe I spoke too fast, and I think that there are some things that I think at the national level, different groups can push for their governments to do that relate to the different process stages of the budget process. I mean, before the budget process, there's this question indeed of voluntary donations, and maybe, and to echo Johannes' point, it's about making sure that you're, of course, talking to the right people. Some people might not be very happy that, say, Germany or their country are giving voluntary donations to OACHR, but some others might. And also, governments have also done this in a way that sometimes does advance their own priorities. So it's also about framing how much actually those, for instance, those the OACHR has been working on things that are priorities for those countries. So the example of Germany, of course, we have the very good example of their prioritization of addressing transnational repression, and they've been one of the strongest funders of this right now, voluntarily at the UN Human Rights Office. But this element of voluntary donations is important. It's really important. To give you one example is France. France is a country that traditionally has been, I think, the 14th. I mean, it's not one of the biggest donors among, say, the top 5 or 10, but it still gives a few million. It used to give a few millions per year to the OECHR. And a lot of it, for instance, went to the working groups on arbitrary detention and enforced disappearances, which overly relied on that voluntary donation. And France abruptly last year cut all their voluntary donations to OECHR. So most of states have reduced their funding because of complicated fiscal situations, etc. But France completely cut that funding last year. And as I just recently saw reports from the discussions in the Senate, it's looking like they're not going to resume it because their overall voluntary donations to the UN are shrinking by a lot. And that is really problematic because we're talking about millions that suddenly the office is deprived of. So a key argument, and of course, depending, you have to then politically see in the political spectrum in your country how to best push for it. But I think one overall important argument is to say no traditional donor or no Western influential government can claim to advance a credible position of UN reform and of seeking a system that works better if they're reducing funding. And this is what we've told France. You cannot be a credible actor in pushing for reform if you're not willing to fund the system. Who are you to give lessons to others? And that might be an argument that they're wanting to hear a little bit more. Now, to go back to the regular budget in itself, if indeed the question of how to influence the ACABQ is really the cornerstone of the issue, and we're still, as ISHR, trying to tackle this, and it's unfortunately remains and will probably remain for a while a very technical issue at the level of New York. There is still a very important role for governments at the General Assembly, so what we call the Fifth Committee, that deals with budget decisions, to influence their positions. So, of course, as I was saying, the human rights budgets are mostly defended over the years by Western countries and Latin American countries, and that last group is really important because within the G77 group of developing countries, China is the one that is really leading the battle alone to cut human rights budgets, and usually China's influence almost defines the group, basically the position of all developing countries. But that doesn't mean that all of them agree. So really, we need new voices that actually support human rights because their priorities are at stake in this group of developing countries. And this is why I mentioned that example of Cabo Verde and the Maldives and Mauritius, who for the first time ever joined Latin American countries in pushing for more human rights funding within the G77. And this is not because they cared about everything that the UN Human Rights Office did, but because they cared about their priorities on climate change, rising sea level, etc. And we really have to find entry points with those governments to mobilize them, and with the argument of saying the only way that you can fund your priorities is ensure that the overall pillar is funding. And lastly, on the very good point about this perception or argument that it's one pillar against the other, I think we also have to understand, this is, I think, based on a truncated view by a lot of politicians, that the UN is just this aggregation of 3 pillars. No, the UN is 3 pillars that are interconnected and that can only be advanced if the 2 others are advancing. It is useless to advance peace and security efforts if you're not tackling root causes of human rights violations. It is useless to advance development if you're not doing from a human rights-based perspective. And so this is where we have to build that argument. And you cannot be advancing some pillar without the other. You cannot be advancing, you cannot be prioritizing the development pillar and then cutting the funding of the UN's Human Rights Office's work on the right to development. It doesn't make sense. You cannot be advancing your priorities on, transitional justice in Syria and not support the work of, the office or the Commission of Inquiry or others that are leading and that have been documenting and leading efforts for this transitional justice. So I think there is an argument there to explain with concrete examples how you cannot silo one pillar from the other from an impact perspective.
Thanks so much, Raphael. I think this was a good complement to the various responses that have been provided already. Jefferson, Marian, would you like to comment on any other point that were raised? I don't see any more questions in the chat box. The time is now or never. If you have any more. Anybody? Questions, answers? No. All right. Well, thanks so much to all the participants who contributed questions and to the panelists for their very enlightening answers. Over to you, Marianne, for the conclusion.
Thank you. Yes, so like I just wanted to share what are the next steps we are envisioning. So we will try to share a recording of this webinar, either this one or the one that we had on Tuesday, which was which had interpretation in 3 other languages. And moving forward, I think we have the question whether you are interested in continuing to work together on strategic engagement around UN80. So we will send a survey to gauge a little bit this interest, and also if there is interest to prepare for a session that is a little bit more interactive, maybe like a workshop kind session where we can collectively and jointly co-create a strategy, like design a strategy of how to engage and influence the upcoming steps of the UN80 initiatives. And I think that's it. So expect from ourselves the webinar, a survey, and if we see that there is interest, an invitation to a little bit more interactive session. Thank you very much for joining us today. I hope it was a lot of information. I hope it was useful, and we look forward to continuing working with you all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.